Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning into my channel Family Shadows. My father came to visit for my son's christening. My mother-in-law, Helen, claimed her $25,000 necklace was missing and called my father a thief. I immediately called the police. 30 minutes later, the truth was revealed, and my husband's entire family was thrown into chaos. Today, I want to tell you the story of what happened on the day that should have been the happiest of my son's new life. What was supposed to be a day of pure joy twisted into a nightmare that sent a shockwave through my husband's family. That morning, the spacious two-story home of the Fan family was filled to the brim with relatives from both sides. The buffet table for the christening reception was laid out beautifully in the living room. A golden roasted chicken sat as the centerpiece, next to a three-tiered cake with blue frosting. Trays of appetizers were still steaming. The sound of cheerful chatter, the patter of children's feet running back and forth, and the occasional warning from an adult to watch the table filled the air. I held my son in my arms, my heart swelling with the simple hope that the day would go smoothly. This was, after all, the first grandson to carry the Fawn name. My father, Arthur, had driven in from his small town a few hours upstate, catching the earliest bus to make it on time. He wore an older white button-down shirt, worn but immaculately ironed, and carried a simple gift basket with a bottle of homemade jam and some fruit from his garden. Seeing him standing quietly in a corner, his kind eyes fixed on his grandson, I felt a lump form in my throat. He was a man of few words, offering a gentle smile to anyone who greeted him, his gaze occasionally shifting to me as if to reassure himself that his daughter was doing okay in her new life. My mother-in-law, Helen, was in her element, wearing a striking red designer dress embroidered with gold thread. Around her neck was a heavy gold chain with a large, brilliant sapphire pendant. She had boasted more than once that it was a family heirloom, worth at least $25,000, she'd say. Every time a new guest arrived with congratulations, she would subtly touch the stone, as if to make sure they couldn't possibly miss it. Just as we were all gathering for a family portrait, Helen suddenly froze. Her hand flew to her neck, and she let out a piercing scream. "Oh my God, my necklace! Where's my necklace?" Her shriek was so sharp that the bustling room fell instantly silent. Relatives who had been laughing moments before stopped mid-sentence, their eyes darting toward her. Helen frantically patted her neck and chest, then spun to face me. "I was just wearing it, not even 10 minutes ago." The room erupted into a nervous murmur. People started looking around. Someone bent down to check under the sofa cushions. Another scanned the floor around the buffet table. I shifted my son to one side, my heart pounding. Then, Helen's eyes swept across the room, finally locking onto my father. He had just stepped out of the guest bedroom, having taken off his jacket because the house was getting warm. Before he could even grasp what was happening, Helen pointed a trembling finger directly at him. "There's a stranger here. If it wasn't one of us, then who else could it be?" Her words hung in the air like a blade. The atmosphere turned frigid. I could hear my own ragged breath. My father stood stunned, his face paling, but he held his back straight. His voice was slow and measured. "I haven't touched anything that doesn't belong to me." Helen's voice turned into a snarl. "A thief who denies it. You just came out of my room, didn't you?" Whispers broke out among the relatives. Some looked at my father with suspicion, while others avoided my gaze as if my family's drama was contagious. I was paralyzed, standing there in the middle of my own son's christening party. My father, a man who had worked with his hands his entire life, was being branded a thief. My husband, Kevin, stood beside me, his face ashen. He looked from his mother to my father, his voice hesitant. "Mom, maybe you should check again. It could have fallen off somewhere." Helen whipped her head toward her son. "Whose side are you on? Is there anyone else here who isn't family?" My father didn't argue. He just added one more sentence, his voice low but clear. "If you need to, you can search me." Hearing that, I felt my heart clench. A man nearly 60 years old, forced to say those words in front of a crowd of strangers, what could be more painful? I placed my son in his bassinet, walked into the center of the room, and faced my mother-in-law. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. "You're accusing my father of theft. Then let's call the police. I want to get to the bottom of this too." A collective gasp went through the room. An aunt tugged at my arm, whispering, "Don't. Dear, why air your dirty laundry in public?" But I knew if I stayed silent today, the label of thief would follow my father for the rest of his life. Helen glared at me. "You dare?" I met her gaze. "I dare, because I know my father didn't do it." Kevin grabbed my hand, pleading. Maya, please don't. Today is supposed to be a happy day. I gently pulled my hand away. How can it be a happy day when my father is being falsely accused like this? I took out my phone, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped it. But I dialed 911. With every ring, every eye in the room was on me. Some people shook their heads, others sighed. A few looked at me, as if I had just single-handedly ruined the entire celebration. My father looked at me, his expression a mixture of worry and pride. He said nothing, but gave a slight nod, as if to say, Asterisk, do what you believe is right. Asterisk, I bit my lip and spoke clearly into the phone. Yes, I'd like to report a theft and a false accusation at my residence. I need officers to come and file a report. After I hung up, the room felt like it was about to explode. My mother-in-law screamed, Are you out of your mind? You're bringing the police into my house over a family matter? I answered her, enunciating every word. My father's honor is not a small matter. In the chaotic swirl of panicked faces, I had no idea that my decision would uncover a secret far more devastating than a $25,000 necklace. At that moment, I was only thinking about clearing my father's name. I never imagined that 30 minutes later, the person who would completely fall apart wouldn't be my father, but my husband's entire family. After that phone call, the words a thief kept ringing in my ears, a slap to my father's dignity. But before I continue with what happened next, I need to go back to the beginning, so you can understand how I ended up in this family, and why I once believed that if I just kept my head down and endured, everything would eventually be okay. My name is Maya. I met my husband, Kevin, when we worked at the same marketing firm. Kevin wasn't a smooth talker, nor was he the type to shower you with compliments, but he was gentle and rarely lost his temper. If someone asked for help, he was always there. When we were dating, I thought his kind nature meant he would be a loving husband. So, even though I knew his family was much wealthier than mine, I said yes. My in-laws, the Fans, owned a successful construction supply company. The business was always bustling with clients. When I married into the family, I stepped into a world of privilege. From the Sub-Zero refrigerator to the polished mahogany dining set, everything in the house gleamed. The home was run with the strict order of people accustomed to being in charge. From my first day, I told myself I had to be proper, to be respectful. I was the daughter-in-law, the outsider. My mother-in-law, Helen, had sized me up from head to toe during our very first meeting. Her gaze said what her mouth didn't need to. She was evaluating me like an item for sale. She asked what my parents did, where they lived, if they owned any property. I answered honestly that my father was a self-employed construction worker, and my mother was a homemaker who tended a large garden. Life wasn't luxurious, but it was stable. Helen let out a small laugh, not loud, but enough for me to hear the condescension in it. In the days that followed, Helen often made comments that sounded like jokes, but were laced with barbs. The first time I cooked dinner, she looked at the spread and remarked lightly, You're quite skilled in the kitchen. I guess you're used to working hard back home." An outsider might have thought it was a compliment, but I knew I was being immediately typecast. The country girl daughter-in-law, accustomed to labor, expected to be docile and hardworking. I didn't argue. I just smiled and told myself that if I was kind and diligent, I would eventually be accepted. I used to think that all mothers-in-law were difficult, and as long as my husband loved me, it would be all right. Kevin, for his part, was a classic conflict avoider. He would often whisper, "That's just how my mom is. Don't let it get to you." I listened and tried to let it go, believing that if we were united as a couple, my mother-in-law's attitude might soften over time. In that house, the one person who made me feel I could breathe was my father-in-law, Richard. He was a quiet man, tall with a deep voice. He rarely got involved in what he called women's business, but whenever Helen's comments went too far, he would sometimes interject with a gruff, "That's enough, Helen. She's our daughter-in-law, not a stranger." Sometimes, a single sentence like that was enough to make me feel protected. Because of this, I truly believe the only issue in this family was my mother-in-law. I thought Richard was a decent, upstanding man, the kind of husband who lived for his family. Helen often bragged about him with a kind of proprietary pride. "My Richard is a good man, you know. He's always straight with me, not like those other husbands out there." Whenever she said that, I would just stay silent. I had no idea that the things people boast about the loudest are often the most fragile. Slowly, I started noticing odd pieces that didn't fit. A few times, while washing dishes, I heard Richard on a call in the backyard. He spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper, as if afraid of being overheard. His tone was unusually soft, not the way he spoke with business partners or his golfing buddies. When I stepped outside, he would abruptly end the call, turn, and ask me casually, "Are you almost done in there?" I'd nod, a strange feeling prickling at me, but then I'd chide myself for being suspicious. Another time, Richard dressed up meticulously, a new dress shirt, sharply creased trousers, and so much cologne I could smell it from across the room. He picked up his car keys and told Helen, "I'm going to meet an old friend." Helen smiled brightly. "Have fun, dear. It's good for you to get out." She turned to me. "That's my husband. Such a model of integrity." I stood in the kitchen and listened, and something felt off. He wasn't a particularly social man and usually dressed simply. Why was he so dressed up, as if for a formal event? Still, I pushed the thought away. I was busy with work, with being a daughter-in-law, with trying not to give Helen any new reason to criticize me. Whenever my father visited, he was always polite and unassuming, bringing a small, humble gift from home, freshly picked vegetables, a free-range chicken, or a few grapefruits from his tree. My father didn't know how to flatter. He would just greet everyone, then quietly find a way to help, whether it was shelling peas or holding his grandson. Although my mother-in-law clearly looked down on my family, she always maintained a veneer of civility in front of others. She might be cold or smile less, but she had never made a scene. Once, my father brought a basket of fruit, and she glanced at it dismissively. "Oh, just leave it there." I saw my father flinch slightly, but he just smiled kindly, pretending not to notice. I felt a pang of hurt for him, but I told myself that this was just Helen, and as long as she wasn't outright insulting, I could live with it. Then I got pregnant. As my belly grew, the atmosphere in the house changed in a strange way. Helen became more attentive, but her concern wasn't for me. It was for the baby I was carrying. She would ask about every ultrasound, what the doctor said, and above all, the gender. It was as if she was waiting for a piece of good news that was hers alone. The day I gave birth to a son, Helen transformed. She called everyone she knew. "We have a grandson, the first of the fawn line." She sent out invitations for the christening weeks in advance, booked a caterer, and bought piles of new clothes for the baby. As for me, she barely asked how I was feeling. I watched this scene with a mix of sadness and relief. Sad, because I felt like a mere vessel. Relieved, because I thought that from now on, things in the house would be calmer. Now that Helen had her precious grandson, maybe she would be less difficult with me. I truly believed that with the arrival of the family heir, everything would smooth over. I told myself to just hold on a little longer, that my mother-in-law would eventually warm up to me, that this house would finally feel like a home. I had no idea that in the shadows of this seemingly perfect family, someone was setting a trap, waiting for the perfect moment, a day full of guests. When all eyes were on a celebration to spring it, a move so vicious it almost destroyed my father's reputation right in the house I had once tried to call my family. After my son was born, I thought my only duties were to be a good mother and wife, to keep the peace. But about a week before the christening, strange signs began to appear in the house. At the time, I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt a persistent unease, like a stone in my shoe. My mother-in-law suddenly started talking about her sapphire necklace constantly. She brought it up deliberately, repeating herself so often that no one could avoid hearing it. She'd mention it while I was washing dishes, while she was holding the baby. "This necklace is my most valuable possession. On the day of my first grandson's christening, I have to wear something spectacular. Let the relatives see that this family has substance." I found it suffocating. The day was supposed to be about the baby, but in her mouth, it became an opportunity to display her status. One afternoon, I was rocking my son to sleep when I overheard her talking to a neighbor over the fence. She was laughing loudly, her voice shrill. "You should come see. We're throwing a huge party for our grandson's christening. I'll be wearing my sapphire necklace so everyone knows just what kind of family we are." The neighbor offered a few compliments, which only made Helen more smug, as if that piece of jewelry was what elevated her above everyone else. I didn't care much for jewelry, but it was then that I noticed my father-in-law, Richard, had a very strange reaction. One evening, Helen took the necklace out to polish it, placing it on the glass coffee table. Richard, who had been watching TV, fell silent. His eyes fixed on it for a long time, not a casual glance, but a look of intense calculation, as if he were weighing something in his mind. I caught his gaze, and a shiver went down my spine. I asked casually, "What are you looking at, Dad?" He started, then gave a weak smile. "Ah, just admiring the stone. It's beautiful." But his tone was unnatural, like he was hiding something. The night before the christening, the house was a flurry of preparation. I was in our room with the baby, occasionally stepping out to get something. Around 10 p.m., I heard someone talking in a very low voice on the second-floor balcony. I assumed it was Helen on the phone, bragging to yet another relative, but it was Richard's voice. He was pressed into a corner, his hand cupped over his mouth as if to muffle the sound. As I walked past to get a bottle of water, I caught a single, clear sentence. "Just wait a few more days. I'll get the money." Just one sentence, but it made my heart stop. Get the money for what? And his voice. It wasn't the voice he used with friends. It was softer, lower, the placating, promising tone of a man trying to soothe someone. I stood frozen for a second, then deliberately made a sound with my footsteps so he would know I was there. He immediately hung up and turned around, his face a mask of calm. He looked at me and asked, naturally, "Not asleep yet?" "No, just getting some water for the baby," I replied. He nodded and walked straight into his room without another word. But from that moment on, I felt a secret slithering through our home. I just couldn't see its shape yet. On the morning of the christening, I was up early with the baby. Downstairs was already abuzz with the clatter of dishes and Helen's voice directing the caterers. I brought the baby down and saw Helen getting dressed, nagging me to put my son in the new outfit she'd bought. While I was busy, I saw Richard walk into Helen's bedroom. He was in there for quite a while. Normally, he rarely entered her room at that hour. She often complained about men messing up a woman's space. But that day, he went in and closed the door. I walked past and heard hushed voices, but couldn't make out the words. A few minutes later, he came out, his expression tense. Before I could ask anything, he said, "I'm just stepping out to pick something up. I'll be right back." He left in a hurry. I watched him go, a strange feeling creeping over me. We had prepared everything. What could possibly be missing that he himself had to go get? Helen didn't ask, too busy with her guests. Kevin was occupied with setting up extra chairs and tables. No one else seemed to notice Richard's abrupt departure. About an hour later, he returned. The day wasn't particularly hot, yet beads of sweat dotted his forehead and his collar was damp. The first thing he did upon entering was scan the room, as if checking to see if anyone had been watching him. I was holding the baby nearby and asked quietly, "Are you okay, Dad? You look tired." He gave me a forced smile. "Ah, just a quick errand." Then he avoided my eyes and walked away. I'm not a suspicious person by nature, but all these disjointed pieces were connecting in my mind in a troubling way. I felt that Richard was hiding something, and that it was somehow connected to the necklace Helen was parading around like a trophy. But I had no concrete proof, so I kept it to myself, telling myself I was probably overthinking things. While the house was buzzing, my father sat quietly in the living room, holding his grandson and rocking him to sleep. He didn't wander around, and he certainly never set foot in my in-laws' bedroom. My father is a meticulous man, always careful not to overstep when visiting someone else's home, let alone entering a private room uninvited. I knew this about him, which made me even more furious when I thought about what was to come. And then, it happened, just as if the trap had been set and waiting. When Helen discovered the necklace was missing, she immediately declared, "The only outsider here is Arthur." The way she said it wasn't a suspicion, it was a verdict. It was as if she already had her scapegoat ready. At that moment, I looked at Richard, expecting him to speak up for my father, to at least say, "Let's not jump to conclusions." But he just stood there, his face an impassive mask, his eyes strange. He didn't defend my father, nor did he join the accusation. He glanced at me for a split second, then looked away, avoiding my gaze. It was that look of avoidance that made my heart sink. I began to believe that something was deeply wrong, that this wasn't a simple case of a lost item. But at that moment, I still didn't have enough information to think further. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I didn't fight this to the end, my father's honor would be trampled on the day of his grandson's christening, in the very house I had tried so hard to call my family. The moment I hung up the phone, my mother-in-law erupted. Helen slammed her hand on the dining table, the impact making the christening cake tremble. She pointed a finger in my face, her voice shrill. "Are you insane, Maya? On your son's christening day, you call the police to my house. Do you want to humiliate this family in front of the entire world?" Before I could respond, she turned to the relatives, seeking allies. "Look at this. What kind of daughter-in-law makes a scene like this?" I stood my ground, my hands still trembling from dialing, but I clenched my jaw to stay calm. I knew if I backed down now, they would only trample my father further. I spoke slowly and clearly. I didn't want to make a scene. But you just called my father a thief in front of all these people. Asterisk. That's times making a scene. Helen's eyes widened. If your family didn't take it, what are you so afraid of? I looked directly at her, no longer flinching. It's precisely because my family didn't take it that I'm not afraid. The statement only heightened the tension. The relatives started whispering among themselves. I overheard someone near the door murmur to their companion, and it was clear they were siding with Helen. Their gazes on my father were no longer those of guests, but of jurors weighing a guilty verdict. My throat felt tight. My father remained seated, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. His face was a mixture of sadness and resilience, as if he were fighting to keep himself from trembling before this hostile crowd. Kevin pulled me into a corner near the stairs. He spoke in a panicked whisper. "Maya, come on. Let's just look for it ourselves first. If the police come, it'll be so embarrassing." I turned to him, my insides burning. I asked, not loudly, but with enough force to make him stiffen. "If it were your father being accused, would you be saying that?" Kevin fell silent. His silence hurt more than any insult. It felt like an admission that, in his eyes, my father's dignity was less important than his family's image. I looked back at my father. He suddenly spoke, his voice trembling but clear. It wasn't a plea for mercy, but the words of a man desperately holding onto his last shred of dignity. "If you need to, you can search me." Those words were like a knife in my heart. I couldn't bear to see him humiliate himself like that. I walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said softly, "Dad, you don't have to say that. I'll clear this up." My father looked at me, his kind eyes red-rimmed. He just nodded, as if telling me not to be afraid. Helen, however, shrieked again, as if afraid of losing her advantage. "Search him. Search him now. If there's nothing, I'll apologize. But if there is, don't blame me." A cold dread washed over me. To her, my father's honor was just something to be gambled with in front of an audience. Just then, my father-in-law, Richard, finally spoke. He stood in the middle of the room, his voice deep, but he didn't clearly take a side. "All right, let's not make a scene. Let's just look for it carefully." I turned to look at him. For the first time since I'd known him, he avoided my gaze. He looked down at the floor, then at the wall, anywhere but at me, as if my eyes might expose something. A chill ran down my spine. A normal person, seeing their daughter-in-law's father being falsely accused, would at least say, "Let's wait for the facts." But he just said, "Let's not make a scene." It sounded more like he wanted to shut the matter down than to find the truth. Helen immediately seized on his words. "See? My husband agrees. This family has a reputation to uphold." I turned to her, my voice turning cold. "You can't build a reputation on someone else's trampled dignity." Helen tossed her head. "Fine. If you're so smart, you can explain it to the police when they get here." Barely 20 minutes later, I heard a car pull up outside. My heart pounded. 2 police officers walked in, their demeanor professional and serious. The room instantly fell silent. The whispers died down, replaced by the whir of the ceiling fan and the sound of a child in the corner who had suddenly stopped crying, as if sensing the tension. The officers asked for a summary of the situation. I explained briefly. My mother-in-law reported a missing necklace and pointed to my father as the thief. "We want to clear up the matter to avoid a false accusation." Helen immediately interjected. "It's a $25,000 necklace. I was wearing it this morning. It just vanished, right here in this house." The police asked everyone to remain calm and requested a timeline of when the necklace was last seen. The air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone held their breath. I looked at my father and saw him trying to stay composed, but his hands were clenched into tight fists. Kevin stood behind me, his face a canvas of confusion. Helen stood with her arms crossed, a look of grim certainty on her face. Richard was unusually quiet, pacing a few steps and then stopping, like a man anxious about something else entirely. The police suggested checking the home security cameras, given the value of the item and the dispute. Helen initially balked, but seeing the eyes of all her relatives on her, she reluctantly agreed to maintain her upstanding image. Kevin went to pull up the feed on his phone. As he opened the app, everyone crowded around to watch. And that's when a detail emerged that sent a chill through me. A segment of the footage from the camera in the hallway outside Helen's bedroom, the one Richard had come out of, was completely black. It wasn't blurry, or pixelated. It was just gone. An officer stared at the screen and asked immediately, "Why is this segment missing?" Kevin stammered, It, it must be a technical glitch." But I knew. In all the time I'd lived in this house, the cameras had never glitched on the exact day of a major family event. When the house was full of people, standing there, watching the black screen, I felt my ears ringing. I began to realize this was not a simple case of a lost object. If it had just fallen off, why would a segment of the camera feed be missing? If it was an accident, why would Helen have accused my father so quickly, as if she had a suspect prepared? And if this was all a coincidence, why did my father-in-law avoid my eyes the moment he said, "Let's not make a scene"? I didn't say it out loud, but a chilling thought took root in my mind. Someone had set the stage, and my father was just the actor they had pushed on it to play the part of the villain. The officer looked at the blank segment of footage and then spoke decisively. "We're going to ask that everyone stay in this room for now. We will need to check each area of the house. Please cooperate and avoid causing any further disturbance." As soon as he finished, the weight in the room became unbearable. The laughter and chatter from earlier were completely gone, replaced by furtive glances, nervous sighs, and the awkwardness of relatives who had walked into a family drama they wanted no part of. Helen immediately raised her voice, as if to steer suspicion away from anyone else. "I'll say it again. I suspect Arthur. He's the only one here who isn't family. He was walking around the house. Who knows what he was doing?" She pointed a finger at my father, her voice filled with conviction. I felt a surge of both anger and pain. My father sat there, his back still straight, but his face had flushed with humiliation. He didn't argue with her, didn't shout back. He just asked a single question that silenced the entire room. "Isn't my honor worth more than $25,000? That question hit me like a physical blow. I tried to swallow, but tears welled up in my eyes. I wasn't crying over the necklace or because of Helen's insults. I was crying because, for the first time in my life, I saw my father so thoroughly and publicly humiliated that he had to verbally defend his own dignity. This man, who had calloused his hands, working his whole life, who had never asked anyone for a thing, was now being called a thief on the day of his grandson's christening. I wiped my tears, forcing myself to stand tall. Kevin looked at me, his eyes flickering with indecision before he looked away, as if he was afraid that holding my gaze too long would force him to choose a side. My father-in-law, Richard, remained eerily silent. He stood by the bar, his hands in his pockets, staring at the floor. His silence no longer seemed like the calm demeanor I had once admired. It felt like something being suppressed, something being hidden. I looked at him, and a vague suspicion began to form. This man was not as innocent as he appeared. The police started their search in the living room, then moved to the area near Helen's bedroom. They asked specific questions. "Where was the necklace kept? Where did you last see it?" Helen answered quickly, "I was wearing it this morning. When I changed into my dress, I took it off and put it in its box in my jewelry armoire, then put it back on. I still had it when I was greeting guests." The officers nodded, then asked a question that made her pause. "Who has a key to your bedroom?" Helen froze for a split second, but it was long enough for me to notice. She shot a quick glance at her husband before answering. "Only me. I always carry it with me." The officer pressed. "No one else has a key?" "No," she said firmly. But the officer then turned to my father-in-law. "Mr. Fawn, do you have a spare key?" Richard flinched slightly before replying. "Yes, I have a spare in case she misplaces hers." Helen quickly jumped in, her tone sharp. "Him having one is the same as me having one. He lives here." The way she said it sounded like she was trying to make it a non-issue, to prevent any further suspicion. But as I stood there, I suddenly remembered something from that morning. While Helen was changing, she had left her handbag on the living room table and called out, "Maya, keep an eye on my purse for a second." I was holding the baby and had only managed a quick okay before turning away. If she always carried her key with her, where was it at that moment? In her purse or in the room? The more I thought about it, the more her story didn't add up. The police continued their search, examining the armoire and the jewelry box. They worked carefully, wearing gloves and inspecting every drawer. Helen stood beside them, muttering, "Check carefully. My property doesn't just grow wings and fly away." Then she shot another glare at my father, as if trying to nail the crime to him with her eyes. I saw my father clench his fists, but he remained silent. Just then, an officer said something that made the entire family freeze. Given the value of the item and the fact that the camera was disabled, We will also need to check recent financial transactions of the family, especially large withdrawals, credit card charges, or pawn shop records, to rule out the possibility of a staged event. When Helen heard this, she went rigid. My husband, Kevin, was visibly startled, and my father-in-law, Richard, I saw the color drain from his face. It wasn't the look of surprise. It was the look of someone who had been hit where it hurts. His already weathered face turned pale. He raised a hand to adjust his collar, even though the air conditioning was on. I looked closer and saw a sheen of sweat on his temples. I had never seen him like this. Richard was always so composed, so deliberate. But in that moment, he looked like a man being pushed to the edge of a cliff. I turned to my father. He met my gaze, his voice low but steady as a rock. "Don't be afraid, Maya. A clear conscience is its own shield." That one sentence steadied me. I took a deep breath, wiped my tears, and nodded. I knew he was trying to comfort me, but he was also comforting himself in the face of this profound humiliation. I looked around the room. The relatives sat in stiff silence. Helen was fuming, ready for a fight. Kevin was caught in the middle, and Richard was sweating under the cool air. And my father, the one being accused, was somehow the calmest person there. At that moment, only one thought consumed me. I would turn this house upside down if I had to. I would make anyone lose face if it meant restoring my father's honor. Because if I backed down today, tomorrow, and every day after, he would be remembered as the in-law who was suspected of being a thief. That was a stain no apology could ever wash away. I didn't know it then, but the secret behind the missing necklace was far from a simple case of false accusation. It was tied to a sordid, illicit relationship that would soon cause the Fan family not just to lose face, but to completely unravel in a way no one could have ever prepared for. As soon as I hung up the phone, my mother-in-law erupted. Helen slammed her hand down on the table, the force of it rattling the christening display. She jabbed a finger in my face, her voice escalating. "Are you insane, Maya? On my grandson's christening day, you're calling the police to my house? Do you want to humiliate this family in front of everyone?" Before I could answer, she pivoted to the relatives as if to rally support. "Everyone, look at this. What kind of daughter-in-law escalates things like this?" I stood there, my hand still trembling from dialing the number, but I bit down hard to keep my composure. I knew that if I softened now, they would only intensify their attack on my father. I spoke slowly, enunciating each word. "I didn't want to escalate things, but you just called my father a thief in front of a room full of people. Asterisk. That times is escalating things." Helen's eyes widened. "If your family didn't take it, then why are you so afraid?" I stared right back at her, no longer flinching. "It's precisely because my family didn't take it that I am not afraid." That statement ratcheted up the tension. The relatives began to whisper. A woman sitting near the door tugged on her husband's sleeve, murmuring something I couldn't quite hear, but I could tell from their glances that they suspected. Their eyes were no longer the friendly gazes of guests, but the calculating stares of people weighing a man's guilt. My throat tightened. My father remained seated, his back ramrod straight, his weathered hands resting on his knees. His face was a mask of stoic sorrow, as if he were trying to hold himself together in front of this hostile crowd. Kevin pulled me into a corner by the staircase. He whispered, his voice frantic. "Maya, please, let's just look for it ourselves first. When the police get here, everyone will know. It's so embarrassing." I turned to look at him, a fire igniting inside me. I asked, not loudly, but with enough intensity to make him freeze, "If it were your father being accused, would you be saying that?" Kevin fell silent. His silence was more painful than any insult. It was a tacit admission that, in his eyes, my father's dignity was secondary to his family's public image. I looked back at my father. He suddenly spoke, his voice trembling but clear. It wasn't the tone of a plea, but of a man desperately trying to preserve his honor. "If you need to, you can search me." Those words felt like a dagger twisting in my heart. I couldn't stand to see my father debase himself like that. I walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said quietly, "Dad, you don't have to say that. I will clear this up." My father looked at me, his kind eyes red-rimmed. He simply nodded, as if telling me not to be afraid. Helen, however, shrieked again, as if she was afraid of things slipping out of her control. "Search him. Go on, search him now. If there's nothing, I'll apologize. But if there is, don't blame me." A chill ran through me. In her mind, my father's honor was just collateral damage, something to be wagered in front of her relatives. It was then that my father-in-law, Richard, spoke up. He stood in the center of the room, his voice deep, but he didn't definitively defend anyone. All right, let's not make a scene. Just search again, carefully. I turned to look at him. For the first time since I'd become his daughter-in-law, he avoided my eyes. He wouldn't look at me directly. He looked at the floor, then at a painting on the wall, as if he was afraid my gaze would expose something he was hiding. A cold feeling crept up my spine. A normal person, seeing his daughter-in-law's father being framed, would at least say something like, "Let's get the facts straight before we make accusations." But all he said was, "Let's not make a scene." It sounded like he wanted to suppress the issue, not uncover the truth. Helen immediately clung to his words. "See? My husband agrees. This family has a reputation to uphold." I turned to her, my voice turning icy. "You can't build a reputation on someone else's trampled dignity." Helen scoffed. "If you're so clever, you can wait for the police and explain it to them." About 20 minutes later, I heard a car pull up outside. My heart hammered against my ribs. 2 police officers entered, their expressions serious and professional. The room went quiet. The murmurs ceased, leaving only the sound of the ceiling fan and a child in the corner who had suddenly gone silent, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. The police asked for a brief overview, and I explained concisely. My mother-in-law reported a missing necklace and identified my father as the person who took it. We would like to clear his name and avoid a false accusation. Helen immediately jumped in. "It's a $25,000 necklace. I was wearing it this morning, and now it's gone, right from inside this house." The police requested that everyone remain calm and asked to establish the time frame of the disappearance. The air in the room was as taut as a violin string. Everyone held their breath. I glanced at my father, who was trying to maintain his composure, but his hands were clenched into tight fists. Kevin stood behind me, his face a mask of conflict. Helen stood with her arms crossed, a look of grim conviction on her face. Richard was unusually quiet, pacing a few steps and then stopping, looking like a man who was anxious about something else entirely. The police suggested checking the home security camera footage, given the value of the item and the conflicting accounts. Helen initially resisted, but seeing the eyes of her relatives on her, she grudgingly agreed to preserve her image of an upstanding homeowner. Kevin went to retrieve his phone to connect to the camera system. As he opened the app, everyone crowded around the screen. And that's when a detail came into view that sent a chill down my own spine. There was a segment of footage from the camera in the hallway outside Helen's bedroom that was completely black, not blurry, not staticky, just a void. The officers stared at it, one of them asking immediately, "Why is this segment missing?" Kevin stammered, It must be a technical glitch." But I knew that in this house, the cameras had never had a glitch, especially not on the day of a major event with a house full of people. Standing in front of that screen, my ears started to ring. I began to sense, with chilling clarity, that this was not a simple case of a lost item. If it had just fallen, why would the camera footage be conveniently missing? If it was an accident, why would Helen have zeroed in on my father so quickly, as if from a script? And if it was all a coincidence, why did my father-in-law avoid my eyes when he said, "Let's not make a scene"? I didn't say it out loud, but I knew in my gut. Someone had set a stage, and my father had been cast as the villain without his knowledge. The police officer looked at the blank segment of the footage and then spoke decisively. "We're going to ask that everyone remain here. Please do not move around freely. We will need to check each room and each area. We ask for your cooperation to avoid any further disruption." His words fell like a dead weight on the room. The earlier sounds of laughter were a distant memory, replaced by furtive glances, nervous sighs, and the palpable discomfort of relatives who had stumbled into a situation no one wanted to be a part of. Helen immediately raised her voice, as if afraid the police would suspect someone else. "I'll say it again, I suspect Arthur. He's the outsider here. He was walking around the house. Who knows what he was up to?" She pointed directly at my father, her voice filled with conviction. I felt a surge of both anger and pain. My father sat there, his back still straight, but his face had flushed with humiliation. He didn't argue with a woman, nor did he shout back. He just asked a single question that silenced the entire room. "Is my honor not worth $25,000? That question felt like a hammer blow to my chest. I tried to swallow, but tears welled up in my eyes. I wasn't crying over the necklace or because of my mother-in-law's accusations. I was crying because, for the first time in my life, I was seeing my father so blatantly and publicly humiliated that he had to verbally defend his own dignity. This man, whose hands were calloused from a lifetime of hard work, who had never asked anyone for anything, was now being called a thief on the day of his own grandson's christening. I wiped my tears, forcing myself to stand tall. My husband, Kevin, looked at me, his eyes flickering with indecision before darting away, as if he was afraid that holding my gaze for too long would force him to choose a side. My father-in-law, Richard, remained eerily silent. He stood by the liquor cabinet, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the floor. His silence no longer seemed like the calm demeanor I had once admired. It felt like he was suppressing something, avoiding something. I looked at him, and a vague suspicion began to form in my mind. This man was not as detached as he appeared. The police started their search in the living room, then moved to the area near Helen's bedroom. They asked very specific questions. Where was the necklace kept? Where did you last see it? Helen answered quickly. I was wearing it this morning. When I went to change into my dress, I took it off and put it in its box in my jewelry armoire. Then I put it back on. I still had it on when I was greeting guests. The officers nodded, then asked a question that made her pause. Who has a key to your bedroom? Helen froze for a split second. A flicker so brief, but I saw it. She shot a quick glance at her husband before answering. Only me. I always carry it with me. The officer pressed. No one else has a key? No, she said firmly. But then the officer turned to my father-in-law. Mr. Fawn, do you have a spare key? Richard flinched slightly before replying. Yes, I have a spare, in case she misplaces hers. Helen quickly jumped in, her tone sharp. Him having one is the same as me having one. He lives here. The way she said it sounded like she was trying to normalize it, to prevent any further suspicion from falling on him. But as I stood there, a small detail from that morning surfaced in my memory. When Helen was changing, she had left her handbag on the living room table and called out to me, Maya, keep an eye on my purse for a second. I was holding the baby and had only managed a quick okay before turning away. If she always carried her key with her, where was it at that moment? In her purse or in the room? The more I thought about it, the more her story seemed to have holes. The police continued their search, examining the armoire and the jewelry box. They worked meticulously, wearing gloves and inspecting every drawer. Helen stood beside them, muttering, check carefully. My property doesn't just grow wings and fly away. Then she shot another glare at my father, as if trying to nail the crime to him with her eyes. I saw my father clench his fists, but he remained silent. Just then, an officer said something that made the entire family freeze. Given the value of the item and the fact that the camera was intentionally disabled, we will also need to check recent financial transactions of the family, especially large withdrawals, credit card charges, or pawn shop records, to rule out the possibility of a staged event. When Helen heard this, she went rigid. My husband, Kevin, was visibly startled, and my father-in-law, Richard, I saw the color drain from his face. It wasn't the look of surprise. It was the look of someone who had been hit exactly where it hurts. His already weathered face turned pale. He raised a hand to adjust his collar, even though the air conditioning was on. I looked closer and saw a sheen of sweat on his temples, as if he had just run a race. I had never seen him like this. Richard was always so composed, so deliberate. But in that moment, he looked like a man being pushed to the very edge of a cliff. I turned to my father. He met my gaze, his voice low but steady as a rock. Don't be afraid, Maya. A clear conscience is its own shield. That one sentence steadied me. I took a deep breath, wiped my tears, and nodded. I knew he was trying to comfort me. But in reality, he was also comforting himself in the face of this profound humiliation. I looked around the room. The relatives sat in stiff silence, no one daring to speak or smile. Helen was fuming, ready for a fight to the bitter end. Kevin was caught in the middle, looking lost. Richard was sweating, and my father, the one being accused, was somehow the calmest person there. At that moment, only one thought consumed me. Even if I had to tear this house apart, even if I had to make someone lose face, I would restore my father's honor. Because if I backed down today, tomorrow, and every day after, he would be remembered as the in-law who was suspected of being a thief. That was a stain no apology could ever wash away. I didn't know it then, but the secret behind the missing necklace was far from a simple case of false accusation. It was tied to a sordid, illicit relationship that would soon cause the Fawn family not just to lose face, but to completely unravel in a way that no one could have ever prepared for. As the police requested, Kevin began to pull up all the camera footage on his phone. His hands trembled as he navigated the app. Helen stood right beside him, her eyes glued to the screen, as if she was afraid someone would try to hide something. The relatives, no longer able to sit still, stood up and craned their necks to see, understanding that the video feed would reveal the truth. When the living room footage played, everything was normal. You could see who came and went. But when it got to the camera in the hallway outside Helen's bedroom, the screen went black for a long stretch before the image returned. An officer, looking at the timestamp, asked, "How long was it off?" Kevin stammered, About 15 minutes or so." The officer corrected him. 17 minutes, which coincides with the time Mrs. Fawn said she was changing her clothes. Helen immediately spun on me, as if she had found the perfect scapegoat. "Who's the most tech-savvy person in this house?" "You are. You must have messed with the settings and turned off the camera to cover for your father." I was so stunned by her shameless accusation that I felt my throat close up. I looked directly at her, my voice low but sharp. "I've been holding my son all morning. I don't have time to stage a drama to frame my own father. If you're going to make an accusation, you'd better have proof." Helen's eyes blazed. "The proof is that the camera was off. If it wasn't you, then who was it?" The police officer cut her off. He asked to see the camera's power source immediately. One of the officers went to the hallway, bent down, and examined the outlet and the power cord. In less than a minute, he returned. This wasn't a technical glitch. The cord was unplugged and then plugged back in. His words were met with a collective gasp, followed by a sudden, chilling silence. A glitch could be blamed on technology, but unplugging a cord could only be done by a person. Helen stammered, Unplugged? Who would do that?" The officer followed up. "During that time frame, who would have had access to this area?" Kevin looked around hesitantly. I, however, remembered clearly that the housekeeper had taken a few days off to visit family and wasn't due back for 2 more days. That left only the family members. Helen quickly said, "We were all busy downstairs. Who would have had time to go up there and unplug it?" I didn't beat around the bush. "That hallway is right outside your bedroom. The only people who could walk in and out of there naturally would be you and Dad." Helen whirled on me, looking like she wanted to tear me apart. "Are you daring to accuse me?" "I'm not accusing anyone," I replied. "I'm just stating a fact about the layout of this house." The officer asked a question, and I answered it. The officer nodded and moved to the next step. "We will need to dust for fingerprints on the jewelry box and the surrounding area. This is a high-value item, and there are signs of the scene being tampered with." At the mention of fingerprints, Helen lost her temper. "You're going too far. It's a necklace, not a murder weapon. My family is respectable. You can't just do whatever you want in our home." The officer replied calmly, "Ma'am, it's precisely because you have accused someone of theft and that person is claiming to be innocent that we must be thorough. If we are not, no one's name will be cleared." They opened the jewelry box in the armoire and, using gloves and specialized tools, began to lift prints. I stood nearby, my heart pounding. I wasn't afraid of what they would find. I was afraid of the truth being twisted yet again. My father sat behind me, still silent, but I knew he was stretched as taut as a wire. Kevin just stood there with his hands clasped, his eyes darting between his mother and me, looking like a man trapped between 2 fires. About 20 minutes later, the preliminary results came back. The officer looked at a piece of paper and then spoke clearly, enunciating every word. "On the jewelry box, we found fingerprints belonging to Mrs. Fawn, the owner, and Mr. Fawn. There is also one unidentified latent print." The room fell silent again. Helen's jaw dropped. "Unidentified? What does that mean? Are you saying a stranger got into my room?" In that exact moment, I saw my father-in-law flinch. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible jerk of his shoulders, but he immediately straightened up as if nothing had happened. But I had seen it. His eyes quickly darted away, and I saw the hand in his pocket clench into a fist. A cold dread washed over me. A normal person, hearing about an unidentified print, would be surprised or angry. His reaction was that of someone who had been found out. The officer turned to him directly. "Mr. Fawn, did you enter your wife's room this morning?" Richard's reply was so smooth it sounded rehearsed. "Yes, I did. I went in to get her blood pressure medication." Helen immediately latched onto his words, as if he had thrown her a lifeline. "See? Of course, he went in. Who else would it be? But a small, clear detail popped into my mind. I hadn't seen him take any medication that morning or even mention it. Usually, he would take his pills in front of everyone, grumbling about his fluctuating blood pressure. But not today. The officer continued, his tone becoming more serious. We will need to examine the phones of the primary family members to rule out any connection to pawn shop transactions or other exchanges. If you are not involved, your cooperation will only help clear your name. Helen snapped, are you suspecting my husband now? He is the most decent man in this house. He has provided for this family for years. You're not going to humiliate him over a necklace, are you? Hearing her call him the most decent man felt like a bitter irony. She defended her husband based on her feelings, while she had condemned my father based on a single glance. I turned to my father-in-law and spoke slowly, each word as heavy as a stone. If you are innocent, Dad, you have nothing to fear. Richard didn't look at me. He just replied curtly, Maya, don't push it. His words made my throat tighten. I was just demanding fairness, and in his mouth, it had become pushing it. The air in the house grew thick and heavy. I could feel a shift happening. The suspicious gazes of the relatives were no longer fixed solely on my father. They started to glance at Richard, at Helen, at the blacked-out camera footage. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt the cloud of suspicion beginning to lift from my father and move towards someone else within the Fan family itself. The atmosphere in the living room was so thick, I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. After confirming the unidentified fingerprint and the unplugged camera, the police stopped asking general questions. One officer turned to my father-in-law, his voice calm but firm. Mr. Fawn, we need to see your call history from this morning. That sentence landed like a stone in a quiet pond. Richard froze for a moment before trying to appear casual. My phone? There's nothing to see on my phone. The officer replied evenly. The camera was disabled during a specific time frame. If you're not involved, checking your phone will help clear your name. I watched him. For the first time all morning, his composure cracked. He took out his phone, but his hand was trembling slightly as he handed it over. Kevin took his father's phone and gave it to the officer. They checked the call log between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. A few seconds later, the officer spoke. There was a call at 8:12 a.m. that lasted for 6 minutes, which falls within the window the camera was off. Helen immediately interjected. So he called a friend. What's so strange about a man making a phone call? The officer didn't respond to her. He just asked Richard, who is it saved in your contacts? My father-in-law answered quickly, almost too quickly. An old friend. The answer was too short, too simple for such a complicated situation. The officer quickly ran the number through a verification system. In less than a minute, he looked up. This number is registered to a Tiffany Miller, born in 1996. The room felt as if the air had been sucked out of it. I could hear my own heart pounding in my chest. 1996. That made her 28 years old my age. I stared directly at my father-in-law, a chill running down my spine. You said an old friend, Dad? An old friend who's my age? My voice wasn't loud, but each word landed with a heavy thud. Kevin, standing next to me, went completely rigid. I saw the color drain from his face. He turned to look at his father, his expression no longer one of absolute trust, but of someone who had just been slapped across the face with betrayal. The police weren't done, they continued. We will also need to check your recent bank transactions, as the value of the missing item is significant. Helen frowned. What does that have to do with the bank? The officer replied. Because there are signs of this being staged, we need to investigate any unusual recent transactions to clarify the situation. Kevin hesitated for a moment, then took his father's phone again to open the banking app. I don't know if I was prepared for what came next, but when the transaction history loaded, the entire room seemed to freeze. 3 days ago, there was a wire transfer for exactly $25,000. The recipient, Tiffany Miller. My mother-in-law's mouth fell open. A transfer? To who? Why don't I know about this? Her voice had lost its shrill edge. It was now the voice of someone whose foundation had just been ripped out from under her. My father-in-law stammered. It was a business deal. A partner. But the officer cut him off. Then why does the amount match the value of the necklace exactly? $25,000. Not a penny more or less. The room was utterly silent. Even the relatives didn't dare to breathe too loudly. I looked at my father. He sat there, his expression pained, but the tension had left his body. He understood where this was going. As for me, I felt a mixture of pain and anger. Pain, Because the man I had once thought was the most upstanding in this family was capable of hiding such a massive secret. Anger, because my father had been used as a shield for it. Kevin took a step forward, his voice hoarse. Dad, who did you send that money to? Tell me. My father-in-law wouldn't look at his son. He just muttered, I told you. It was for business. But he couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The officer said bluntly, we will have to ask Miss Miller to come in for questioning. If she's not involved, she can prove it herself. At that moment, Richard shot to his feet, his voice sharp. There's no need. This is a family matter. That sentence cut through the room like a knife. Helen spun to face her husband. A family matter? Giving that girl money is a family matter. She was practically screaming. Kevin stared at his father. His eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. What are you hiding? Dad, I didn't need the police to say another word. I understood completely. If it were just an old friend or a business deal, no one would react so violently to the suggestion of a police interview. The phrase "this is a family matter" was an unwitting confession that this was no longer about a missing necklace. It had become about another secret, a larger, more sordid one. My mother-in-law staggered back a few steps, grabbing the back of a chair for support, her voice trembling. Tell me it's not what I think it is. But my father-in-law remained silent. His silence was more damning than any confession. The relatives started looking at each other, their expressions shifting from suspicion to shock. Standing in the middle of that room, I suddenly realized something with perfect clarity. The $25,000 necklace wasn't the only thing that had been lost that day. A wife's trust, a son's respect, and the entire facade of the respectable family that my mother-in-law had so proudly paraded, it was all cracking apart. And I knew, from the moment my father-in-law yelled, "This is a family matter," that the story had taken a different turn. It was no longer about who stole what. It was about a dirty secret being dragged into the light in front of a house full of relatives, on a day that was supposed to have been the happiest. After my father-in-law's desperate outburst, "This is a family matter," the tension in the room became suffocating. But the police didn't back down. One of the officers looked directly at Richard, his voice still calm, but now unyielding. Sir, when there are signs of a staged crime scene and a false accusation, we are required to investigate fully. This cannot be resolved with just words. My mother-in-law, her earlier confidence completely gone, looked from her husband to the officers, her voice trembling. Are you really going to pursue this? The officer's reply was succinct. Our job is to determine the facts. If we don't, an innocent man will carry this accusation for the rest of his life. Hearing that, I glanced over at my father. He sat quietly, his eyes red with restrained emotion. I promised myself then and there that no matter what secrets came to light today, I would not back down. The police requested to see the footage from the camera outside the front gate. This camera was on a separate system, so it hadn't been affected when the one in the hallway was unplugged. Kevin, his hands fumbling, opened the app again. I could see the panic in his eyes. He knew that the more they looked, the more likely it was that his own father would be implicated. The image from the front gate camera appeared, clear as day. The officers rewound to the morning's time frame, and then a scene unfolded that silenced the entire room. At a little after 8 a.m., my father-in-law, Richard, was seen opening the gate and walking out. He moved quickly, as if trying to avoid being seen. Just 10 minutes later, he returned. The officer paused the video and zoomed in. In Richard's hand was a small, black pouch. My mother-in-law blinked rapidly, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. She stammered, "What? What is that bag?" Kevin stared at the screen, his face tight with tension. A cold dread washed over me as I remembered him leaving abruptly that morning to pick something up. The officer asked Richard directly, "Sir, you went out this morning around 8:15. What was in this pouch?" My father-in-law swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. It's medication. I went to the pharmacy to pick up a refill." Helen immediately clung to his explanation like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. "See? He went to get my medicine. You're all reading too much into this." But the officer didn't buy it. He pointed to the screen. "If you were buying medicine, you would have returned with a pharmacy bag, maybe a receipt. This looks more like a personal pouch." Then he requested to inspect the trunk of Richard's car. The moment he said, "Inspect the trunk," I saw my father-in-law freeze, the exact same reaction he'd had when he heard about the unidentified fingerprint. It was a split-second reaction, but it was enough for me to know he was scared. Kevin was startled. "The trunk? Why do you need to check the trunk? It's standard procedure, the officer replied. We're trying to trace the movement of the asset. My mother-in-law, now frantic, started to protest. No, that's his car. It's private property. You have no right. But the officer stated plainly, if the family refuses to cooperate, we will file a formal report and require everyone involved to come down to the station for questioning. The choice is yours. Helen looked around. Her relatives were staring at her, their expressions no longer supportive but filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Helen bit her lip, her voice weak. Fine. Check it. We all moved outside to the driveway. I stood by the door, holding my son, my heart pounding so hard my hands felt cold. My father stood a little behind me, his gaze fixed on the scene unfolding in the driveway, a man silently waiting for the justice he deserved. Kevin opened the trunk of his father's car. As the lid lifted, everyone leaned in to look. At first glance, there was nothing, no necklace. Just as Helen was about to breathe a sigh of relief, one of the officers leaned in further. Tucked into a corner, wedged beside the spare tire, was a thin paper envelope. He pulled it out, glanced at the document inside, and held it up. A pawn ticket. I felt my legs go weak. My mother-in-law shrieked. What? The officer read the details aloud. Dated yesterday. Pawn value, $25,000. And at the bottom, the signature of the seller, Richard Fawn. I felt like I was going to collapse. Kevin stood frozen, his mouth agape, unable to form a word. The relatives behind us gasped, then fell silent, realizing this was a point of no return. My mother-in-law snatched the ticket from the officer's hand, staring at it as if she could will it out of existence. Then she spun on her husband, her voice hoarse with betrayal. Tell me this is a misunderstanding. Explain this. But Richard just stood there, his face ashen, sweat pouring down his temples. He couldn't speak. His silence was the most damning confession of all. The officer spoke clearly, his tone neutral, but every word landing like a hammer blow. At this point, we have sufficient evidence to suspect that you pawned the asset yourself and then staged a fake crime scene. We ask for your full cooperation to clarify your motive. And we strongly advise the family to cease making false accusations against another party. I burst into tears, but they weren't tears for the necklace or for my collapsing in-laws. They were tears of relief for my father. I turned to him and grabbed his hand, my voice choked. Dad, I'm so sorry I let you go through this. My father looked at me, his eyes kind but weary. He said softly, the truth always comes out, Maya. At that moment, my mother-in-law seemed to snap. She lunged at Richard and slapped him hard across the face, right there in front of everyone. The sound cracked through the stunned silence. She screamed, tears streaming down her face. Who did you get that money for? Tell me, you let my daughter-in-law's father take the blame for you. Are you even human? Richard stumbled back, his hand on his cheek, his eyes fixed on the ground. Kevin stood between them, paralyzed by shock and shame, as if his entire world had just crumbled. And I just held my son tighter, a cold realization dawning on me. From the moment that slap landed, the Fan family was officially broken. And no matter how they tried to piece it back together, it would never be the same. The sound of my mother-in-law's slap hung in the dead air of the driveway. The relatives stood in a stunned circle, some turning away in embarrassment, others just staring with their mouths agape. My father-in-law, Richard, stood rooted to the spot like a statue, his eyes downcast, his hand still covering the red mark on his cheek. He looked like a man who had been completely hollowed out. The police officer, maintaining his professional tone, said, Mr. Fawn, we need you to explain your motive. We currently have evidence of a staged crime and a false accusation. Helen, still trembling, screamed before he could answer. Tell us, what did you need the money for? You were willing to let my daughter-in-law's father be branded a thief. Are you even human? Richard swallowed hard, his lips moving but no sound coming out. Kevin, his face flushed with a mixture of shame and fury, his voice cracking, said, Dad, just say it. How am I supposed to face my wife after this? I looked at my husband, my heart aching for him. I knew this was the moment his trust in his father was shattered, and this family was imploding right before my eyes. Finally, Richard managed to force out a few words, his voice hoarse and low. I needed the money urgently. Helen let out a bitter laugh. Urgently? When have we ever been short on money? Richard squeezed his eyes shut, like a man who had backed himself into a corner with no way out. Tiffany. She was in trouble. I felt a chill go through me at the mention of her name. I took a step forward and looked directly at him. What kind of trouble required you to sell this family's honor? What kind of trouble made you set a trap for my father? My questions were like daggers. Richard's lips trembled, and then, like a man pushed beyond his breaking point, the confession tumbled out in a choked whisper. She's pregnant. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was as if a bolt of lightning had struck. My mother-in-law's mouth fell open, and she let out a strangled sob. Kevin exploded. He yelled, his voice breaking with disbelief. Are you insane, Dad? That girl is my wife's age. Have you no shame? I saw his shoulders shaking. I had never seen him so completely lose control. Helen began to wail, pounding on her husband's chest with her fists. You betrayed me. You betrayed me. And then you framed an innocent man. You're a monster. How could you be so cruel? Richard didn't resist. He just stood there and took it, like a man who knew he had no defense left. The police asked for calm and then continued their questioning to clarify the timeline. How long has this relationship been going on? Richard, his head bowed, mumbled to the ground. Over a year, Helen shrieked. Over a year? I've been living with you this whole time, and I knew nothing? She turned to me, her eyes wild and red. She's your age, Maya. My husband. My husband. Oh, God. She crumpled to the ground, clutching her chest as if she couldn't breathe. I stood there, frozen. I felt no satisfaction in that moment, only a profound sense of disgust. A man in his late 50s, living behind a facade of respectability, had been carrying on an affair with a girl young enough to be his daughter. The thought alone made my skin crawl. The police officer pressed on. What was the $25,000 for? Richard answered quickly, as if wanting it all to be over. 2. To deal with the pregnancy. Kevin slammed his hand on the trunk of the car, his voice raw. Deal with it how? What were you going to do to her? No. Not like that, Richard said, horrified. She said she needed the money for hospital bills, for prenatal care. I looked at him, my voice cold. And you didn't dare tell Mom. So you chose to pawn her necklace and blame my father instead, right? Richard's silence was his answer. The police asked him to recount the entire sequence of events. Like a man in a trance, Richard confessed everything. He admitted to pawning the necklace the day before because he needed the cash quickly and was afraid his wife would see a large bank transfer. He had waited for the christening, a day with a house full of people, to stage the theft. He had calculated that my father, being an outsider from a small town, quiet, unassuming, would be the easiest person to suspect. He figured all it would take was one loud accusation from Helen, and the crowd would naturally turn on the stranger. Hearing this, I trembled with rage. I asked, my voice choked, and you unplugged the camera? Why? He mumbled, 2. To make it look more real. I felt like someone was squeezing my throat. A disgusting, calculated plan to protect a sordid secret, and the price was my father's honor. The officer stated clearly that the act of staging a crime and making a false accusation could be prosecuted, depending on the severity and the wishes of the wrong party. Hearing this, Helen seemed to snap out of her hysteria. She scrambled over and fell to her knees in front of the police officers, tears and snot streaming down her face. Please, officers, please don't file a report. We can handle this as a family. I'm begging you. Please. I watched my mother-in-law kneeling on the pavement, and my heart felt like ice. The same woman who had just been screaming thief at my father was now begging for the matter to be kept quiet, all because she was afraid of losing face. The officer said sternly, we can allow the family time to mediate, as this involves marital property and internal dynamics. However, if the falsely accused party wishes to press charges, we will proceed according to the law. Helen turned to me, her eyes pleading. Maya, please, tell them not to. Don't make this a bigger deal. I looked at her, a strange feeling washing over me. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't exactly anger. It was clarity. I understood that this tragedy was far from over. It had just shifted from a missing necklace to something much more terrifying. Collapse, humiliation, and consequences that no one in this family could ever pretend hadn't happened. After that day, the police filed a preliminary report, noting the evidence of a staged crime and false accusation, leaving the decision to press charges up to my father. Because my mother-in-law had begged, and the relatives had quietly scurried away in shame, the matter was temporarily closed as an internal family issue. But that was only on the surface. Inside that house, everything was fractured beyond repair. In the days that followed, a funeral silence fell over the house. Helen no longer had the energy to criticize me or nitpick about how I cared for the baby. She just sat in her chair, staring into space, her face gaunt. She couldn't sleep, jumping at every small sound. I often walked past her room and saw her sitting in the dark, clutching her chest and muttering, "The shame, the shame." She was terrified the neighbors would find out, that the relatives would gossip. The title of the respectable Mrs. Fan had been tainted by a husband who had fallen for a young girl, a stain she would carry forever. Sometimes she would blame me, her voice a broken whisper. "It's because you called the police. Now everyone knows." I didn't argue. I just looked at her and said, "Ask yourself who humiliated whom first." As for Richard, after the slap and the public exposure, he became a different person. He was even quieter than before, sullen and withdrawn, avoiding my eyes and Kevin's. At dinner, he would eat a few bites in silence and then retreat to his room. Once, I passed him on the stairs, and he glanced at me with an expression that was not just shame, but something akin to fear. I began to understand that he wasn't just afraid of his family knowing. He was afraid of the young woman herself. Kevin was like a man adrift. He started coming home from work later, rarely smiling or speaking. The man who used to say, "Just let it go for the sake of peace," was gone. Some nights, he would lie in bed, with his back to me, sighing heavily. I knew he was caught between the shame of being his father's son and the pain of being my husband. But for me, the most important thing was that my father's name had been cleared. I called him the next day to apologize one more time. He just said, "Take care of your son, Maya." "I'm fine." Hearing his simple words made my throat tighten. I thought things would slowly quiet down. The truth was out. Everyone knew my father was innocent. Richard had been exposed. Helen had seen the consequences of her baseless accusations. I thought the worst of the storm had passed. But life rarely grants you peace so easily. 3 days later, in the afternoon, as I was rocking my son to sleep, the doorbell rang. Kevin answered it and came back with a plain yellow envelope with no return address. He frowned. "Who sent this?" I thought it was strange, too. We rarely receive mail like that. Kevin tore it open right there, in the living room. A second later, his face went white. I walked over. Inside, the envelope was a stack of color photographs. They were of my father-in-law and a young, stylishly dressed woman, standing very close in a hotel lobby. Another photo showed them getting into an elevator, her hand holding his tightly. The pictures were so clear there was no denying it. I only needed a glance to know the woman was Tiffany. A small, folded note fell out from among the photos. The handwriting was neat and cold. Asterisk. "If you don't want these to go public, get another $300,000 ready." Asterisk. The words made my skin crawl. Kevin crumpled the note in his fist. He said through gritted teeth, "She's blackmailing us." Before I could reply, Helen rushed out of her room as if she had a premonition. She saw the photos and let out a strangled cry, collapsing onto the sofa. "Oh my God! There's more." She was shaking, her hands clutching her head. "Is she trying to kill me?" Richard heard the commotion and came downstairs. The moment he saw the photos, he froze, his face turning a deathly pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. Helen lunged at him, pounding on his chest, sobbing and screaming. "Haven't you ruined this family enough? Now she wants another $300,000. Are you planning to sell the house for her too?" Richard didn't fight back. He just said in a small voice, "Give it to me." He took the note, his eyes scanning the words, and I saw it clearly. Fear. Not fear of his wife's anger or his son's contempt, but fear of the person out there who had him in her grip. He swallowed hard, his voice a hoarse whisper. "She's crazy." I turned to Kevin and asked a simple question that was also a wake-up call. "Do you really think a 28-year-old woman is genuinely in love with a man in his late 50s? Kevin looked at me, his eyes darkening. He didn't answer, but his silence was enough. He was starting to see it too. Helen was in a full-blown panic. She ran to the windows, pulling the curtains shut, locking the front door as if the neighbors could see through the walls. She whispered, like someone who had lost her mind, "If she sends these pictures out, how can I live? How can I face anyone at the market?" She looked at me, her eyes a mixture of fear and anger. "Maya, what are we going to do? You're the one who's so good at calling the police." I took a deep breath and stared at the note. I no longer saw Tiffany as a vulnerable mistress, the image Richard had tried to paint to excuse himself. I realized she knew the truth about the necklace was out. She knew this family was in chaos, and she had chosen this exact moment to strike again. The pregnancy was likely just a pretext. Her real goal was money, control, and the power to pull our strings. I looked at my father-in-law. The false air of dignity was gone, replaced by the humiliating fear of a man caught in a trap. And in that moment, I understood something chilling. Perhaps the one being played wasn't just our family. It was him. I looked at my son sleeping peacefully in his bassinet, his innocent face oblivious to the ugliness around him. A coldness seeped into my bones. I knew that from now on, I wasn't just protecting my father's honor. I was up against a young, ambitious, and calculating woman who was holding the entire family hostage with the one thing they feared most: their reputation. I thought the worst of the storm had passed, but I was wrong. Tiffany was just getting started. The note demanding $300,000 lay on the coffee table like a fresh wound in our already shattered home. Helen was clutching her chest, gasping for air. Kevin paced back and forth like a caged animal, and Richard sat slumped on the edge of a chair, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. I stood by the window, holding my son, a cold dread settling in my heart. I knew that envelope wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And just as I predicted, less than half an hour later, the doorbell rang, not a polite chime, but a series of insistent, rapid-fire presses, as if someone was trying to force their way in. Helen jumped, grabbing Kevin's arm in terror. "Don't open it. What if it's her?" Kevin scowled. "If we don't open it, she'll just make a bigger scene outside." I placed my son back in his bassinet and walked to the door myself. The moment I opened it, before I could even register her face, a voice, sweet but icy, rang out. "Hi there. I'm Tiffany." I froze. Tiffany hadn't come in secret. She was standing on our doorstep, dressed in a stylish outfit, bright red lipstick, her hair perfectly coiffed, carrying a designer handbag. Her eyes swept over me, then past me into the house, as if she were surveying her own territory. Helen ran out from the living room. The moment she saw Tiffany, her face went white. She shrieked, her voice tearing. "Get out, you homewrecker. You've destroyed my family, and you have the nerve to show your face here?" Tiffany didn't even flinch. She just tilted her head and gave a small, dismissive smile. "You should calm down, Mrs. Fawn. I'm here to have a civilized conversation." Her condescending tone was like gasoline on a fire. Helen lunged at her, ready to pull her hair. I immediately stepped between them. "Mom, don't turn our home into a public spectacle. This is exactly what she wants." Helen was panting, her eyes blazing with fury. "Get out of my way. I'll tear her apart." Tiffany stood calmly, even taking a moment to adjust the strap of her purse. Her voice remained steady. "I don't want to embarrass you, but you shouldn't force me to make this a public matter." Just then, Richard emerged from the living room. He looked as if all the blood had drained from his body. He stared at Tiffany, his lips trembling. "Tiffany, what are you doing here?" Tiffany turned to him, her expression a mix of feigned hurt and cold control. "I had to come, Richard. I can't let my child be born without a name." Kevin shot up from his seat, his teeth gritted. "What child? Don't you dare bring your dirty games into my house." Tiffany gave Kevin a long, dismissive look. Then she turned to me, her eyes probing. "You must be Kevin's wife. You should know that, in this situation, you're the one with no right to make decisions." I stared back at her, my voice cold. The right to make decisions belongs to the truth, and the truth has nothing to fear. Tiffany smirked and pulled out her phone, putting it on speaker right there in the entryway. A recording played, and Richard's voice filled the air, soft and pleading. Asterisk, honey. Please don't make a scene. Just let me handle the money. Asterisk. Helen looked as if she had been slapped again. She grabbed my arm, her voice a strangled whisper. What? What did he just call her? Tiffany switched off the recording, a triumphant smile on her lips. Should I play the rest? I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to remain steady. If you want to talk, come inside. But if you step into my home and say one more lie, I will be the one to call the police. Tiffany walked past me as if she owned the place. She even had the audacity to say to Helen, "Don't be so stressed. I'm not here to steal your husband. I'm just here to claim what's mine." Helen's voice was a low growl. What's yours? There is nothing in this house that belongs to you. Tiffany laughed, glancing at Richard. Is that so? Richard, do you agree? I was stunned by the way she said his name. It was so brazenly familiar that the entire room went stiff. Kevin's face turned beet red. Shut your mouth, he yelled. Helen was trembling with a mixture of rage and humiliation. She turned to her husband. "Did you hear that? Did you hear what she just called you?" Richard just stared at the floor, unable to look at anyone. Then, Tiffany turned her attention to my father, who had been sitting silently in a corner, a witness to this whole sordid affair. She looked at him for a moment and then said, her tone casual, "And you, honey, you shouldn't look at me like that. I haven't done anything wrong." I felt the blood rush to my head. Asterisk, honey? Asterisk. She had just called my father honey in my house, in front of me, my mother-in-law, and my sleeping child. My father was taken aback, his hands clenching, but he kept his voice steady. "Young lady, you will speak to me with respect. I am old enough to be your father." Tiffany just shrugged. "Oh, sorry. Force of habit. Don't be so sensitive." Her force of habit was a slap in the face to every single person in that room. I took a step forward and locked eyes with her. "Are you here to extort money, or are you here to humiliate people?" Tiffany gave a half smile. "You can call it extortion if you like. I call it collecting a debt for services rendered." I cut to the chase. "No more games. You want $300,000, right?" She nodded slightly. "You're a smart one." Helen, though crying, managed to scream. "On what grounds? What leverage do you possibly have?" Tiffany leaned in, her voice sweet as poison. "My leverage is your family's secrets. I know exactly what you're most afraid of." Richard suddenly found his voice, a weak attempt to regain control. "Tiffany, that's enough." She spun on him, her eyes as sharp as knives. "Are you in any position to tell me what's enough? You made promises. You sent the money. Now you're telling me it's enough?" Richard swallowed hard. I don't have it." Tiffany tilted her head. "Then, sell the car. Sell some property. You told me your construction supply business was a huge success." That comment hit its mark. I saw Helen turn pale. The business was her pride, her status, her entire identity. Tiffany walked over to the christening display, glanced at the cake, and then delivered a line designed to trample all over our day. "For a first grandson's christening, there's an awful lot of screaming. I thought this was a respectable family." Helen gasped for air. Kevin clenched his fists. I felt my hands go cold. She was a master of psychological warfare, threatening one moment, mocking the next, all to make us lose control. I looked directly at her and said, my voice clear and deliberate, "Whether you get the money is not my decision. The person who caused this mess can deal with it. But you should remember, by coming here, you've exposed yourself. Do you really think you can extort a family and just walk away?" Tiffany laughed. "Are you threatening me? Go ahead and try. But you should remember that the person with the most to lose here isn't me. It's her." She gestured to Helen, then added, her voice a soft, venomous whisper, "Mrs. Fawn has spent her whole life protecting her reputation. All I have to do is whisper, and that reputation will be gone." I turned to my father-in-law, my voice like ice. "Did you hear that, Dad? You have allowed this person to put a noose around our entire family's neck." Richard stood there, mute. His silence was infuriating. It was his silence that had allowed my father to be humiliated, that had pushed his wife into a panic, that had left me and my husband with no good options. Tiffany slung her purse over her shoulder as if she was bored. She took out her phone, tapped a few times, and then said nonchalantly, "I'll give you until Friday night. And don't think calling the police will solve this. The police can handle the law, but they can't control public opinion." Then she turned to my father and dropped one last, shameless comment. "Honey, maybe you can talk some sense into her. I'd hate for her to have a heart attack from the stress." I saw my father grip the arm of his chair, but all he said was a firm, "Get out of my house." Tiffany shrugged and walked to the door. Before she left, she looked back at me with a smirk. "You're a sharp one, Maya. But being sharp doesn't help when someone else holds all the cards." Then she glanced at Richard and delivered her parting shot. "Remember what I said. Don't make me ask again." The door closed, and the house fell silent. Helen collapsed onto the sofa, her face in her hands. Kevin stood like a statue. Richard leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. And I looked at the note and the photos on the table and felt a bitter, ironic laugh rise in my throat. A single necklace had exposed a secret, and that secret had now become a noose dangling over all our heads. I looked down at my son, sleeping peacefully, then back at the broken people in the room. I knew, from the moment Tiffany had dared to walk in here and call my father honey and my mother-in-law by her first name, that she didn't just want money. She wanted power. She wanted to make this entire family bow to her. And I knew with absolute certainty that this game was not going to end with $300,000. It had only just begun. And if I wasn't smarter than all of them, my father would be dragged through the mud all over again. After Tiffany's brazen visit, where she tossed threats around like confetti, I knew that if I let things continue down the path of my mother-in-law's fear of public shame, the blackmail would never end. They had scented weakness. And when predators sense weakness, they attack relentlessly. That night, I couldn't sleep. Kevin lay beside me, his back to me, sighing heavily. From her room, I could hear Helen tossing and turning, punctuated by a dry, nervous cough. Richard remained shut in his room like a ghost. The house was silent, but it was a loud silence, filled with the palpable panic that was eating away at each of them. I decided to do something I knew Helen would hate, but if I didn't, we would be led to the slaughter by Tiffany. I quietly called Dave, the technician who had installed our security system last year. He knew the system inside and out. I kept it brief. "Dave, I need you to come over and check something. It's important." He heard the urgency in my voice and agreed to come first thing in the morning. When Dave arrived, Helen immediately scowled. "Why is the technician here? Isn't this house humiliated enough?" I replied flatly, "Mom, if you want peace, we need to find out who has their hands around our throats." She started to argue, but I placed my phone on the table, making it clear I was ready to call the police again, and she fell silent. Kevin, looking exhausted, just murmured, "Mom, just let Maya handle it." Dave opened his laptop and connected it to the camera's main unit. As he worked, he explained, "If the cord was just unplugged, the system logs a power loss. But if someone accessed the system remotely, there will be a digital footprint." Hearing the words digital footprint made my heart race. I knew if we could find proof of remote access, it would reveal a deeper layer to this whole mess. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It was premeditated. Dave stared at the screen for a few minutes, then looked up. His voice was quiet but clear. "Maya, the camera in the hallway wasn't just unplugged. Right before it happened, someone accessed the system remotely to disable the motion alerts. That means someone had the password." Helen's jaw dropped. Remote access. But who? Only family knows the password. I looked directly at her. Exactly. Or someone outside the family was given the password. Richard, sitting a few feet away, gripped the arms of his chair. He said nothing, but I saw his jaw clench. Dave continued, "I can trace the device that logged in, but I'll need the exact time." I immediately told him to check the time frame when the camera was off. He typed a few commands and then turned the laptop towards me. On the list of logged-in devices was one I didn't recognize, not Kevin's phone, not Helen's tablet, not my laptop. Dave pointed to it. "This device logged in at 8:09 a.m., disabled the alerts, and then the power was cut." Helen was trembling. So this was a setup from the beginning." My voice was cold. "If it wasn't a setup, do you think Tiffany would have the confidence to walk in here and demand $300,000? I turned to Kevin. "Do you still have Tiffany's phone number?" Kevin, looking dazed, pulled out his phone. I gave the number to Dave. "Can you cross-reference? See if the device that logged in has any connection to this number." Dave worked quickly. A few minutes later, he looked up, his expression serious. "It's highly likely. The device connected to a public Wi-Fi network in the same area, as this phone number's registered address, and there's an overlapping connection timestamp." In other words, Tiffany hadn't just blackmailed us. She had been involved from the start. It was a planned, coordinated attack. At that moment, Helen looked like she had been deflated. She whispered, "Oh my God." She set the stage. She played this entire family. I looked directly at my father-in-law, my voice leaving no room for excuses. "Did you hear that, Dad? This woman is treating you like an ATM, and you're still trying to protect her?" Richard's lips moved, but no sound came out. I knew why. He wasn't just afraid of being exposed. He was terrified of what Tiffany would do to him next. Just as the tension reached its peak, the doorbell rang. A middle-aged man with a worried expression stood there, holding a file. I recognized him instantly, the owner of the pawn shop. I had contacted him earlier, using the information on the pawn ticket, knowing I needed one more piece to lock the story down. He looked around nervously. I'm just here to tell the truth, mister. Fawn came in the other day with the item. The next day, this young woman showed up. He glanced towards the door, as if he expected Tiffany to materialize. She said she was handling the paperwork for him. She even mentioned that Mr. Fan's sister might call to negotiate if there were any problems. Helen spun on her husband, her eyes blazing. Did you hear that? She was manipulating you. She set this whole thing up. Richard's head fell into his hands, his entire body slumping. Kevin exploded. So, she was stalking our family from the beginning. I didn't wait for an answer. I took out my phone and played a short video clip I had gotten from a neighbor's security camera, dated 2 days before the christening. The video showed Tiffany, wearing a hat and sunglasses, standing across the street from our house, looking at it, typing on her phone, and then walking away. I put my phone on the table. Here, she was casing our house days before the party. This was no coincidence. Kevin yelled, his voice raw with fury. She was watching us. Helen clutched her chest, breathing in ragged gasps as if she was about to faint. Oh, the shame. How will I ever live this down? Richard collapsed back into his chair, his hands covering his face. Tiffany wasn't even there, but I could almost hear her laughter in every piece of evidence. A woman so young, yet so calculating. This was far beyond a simple affair. I said one final thing to make everyone understand the full picture. He may have been greedy, and that's how he got caught in the trap. But she was the one who said it. Helen whispered, her voice broken. So what do we do now? I looked at her, my voice firm and resolute. From now on, if she ever shows her face here again, this is no longer an internal family matter. I am taking this to the police. No one is going to use their fear of shame to drag my father through the mud ever again. After I spoke, I turned to my father. He was looking at me, his expression not one of joy, but of a father who had just seen his daughter finally find her strength. And I knew. From that moment on, the game had changed. Tiffany was no longer in control. And if she wanted to play one more round, I would show her the true cost of her audacity. After the morning's revelations, Dave's analysis of the camera system, the pawn shop owner's confirmation of Tiffany's involvement, the air in my in-laws' house was thick with a toxic silence. Helen sat motionless, staring into nothingness. Kevin paced the floor, occasionally punching the walls softly, then sighing in a way that sounded like a pressure valve about to burst. Richard had collapsed into a chair, his back hunched, his face a sickly gray. He looked like a man who had been stripped bare in front of his family. I thought that with so much evidence against her, Tiffany would have the sense to disappear. But people like her, when cornered, don't retreat. They attack, aiming for the most painful spot, hoping to create enough chaos to cover their escape. That afternoon, as I was preparing a bottle for my son, the doorbell rang again. Kevin and I exchanged a look. We both knew. She was back. Helen shot up from her chair, her voice a panicked whisper. Don't open it. Don't let her in. She's here to humiliate me again. I set the bottle down and walked to the door. If she's here, we're going to finish this once and for all. I opened the door, and there she was. Same red lipstick, same air of arrogant calm, but her eyes were harder, colder. She walked in without an invitation. Seeing Helen, she smirked. Why are you so jumpy, Mrs. Fawn? I'm not going to bite. Helen, though pale, managed to retort. You have the nerve to come back? What more do you want? Tiffany's gaze shifted to me. I want to talk to Maya. She's making things very difficult for me. I met her stare. If things are difficult, you can leave. No one invited you here. Tiffany slowly pulled out her phone, as if preparing to launch her final assault. Her voice was a venomous purr. Maya, you're so tough, but are you sure you're standing on solid ground? Before I could react, she dropped the bomb, right in the middle of our living room. Are you sure that baby in the bassinet is the true Fawn heir? The world stopped. Helen looked like she was choking. Kevin froze, his eyes wide with shock. Richard went ashen, his lips trembling, and my ears started to ring. This wasn't blackmail anymore. This was a scorched earth tactic, designed to plant a seed of doubt so poisonous that our family would tear itself apart from the inside. If she succeeded, all the evidence I had gathered would become meaningless. Helen spun on me, her eyes red with a mixture of fear and fury. What is she talking about? Maya. I saw her hands shaking uncontrollably. In that instant, I understood what she feared most. It wasn't losing money. It was losing her precious grandson, the one thing she paraded to the world, the pillar she was clinging to for her identity. Tiffany smiled, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. I'm just saying, but if Mrs. Fawn wants to be sure, she should ask her own son. The way she said her name was so condescendingly familiar. It was a power play in itself. Kevin exploded. Shut up. Don't you dare say another word. Tiffany just shrugged. The truth often hurts, doesn't it? I looked at Kevin, then at Tiffany. I knew if I let him argue, if I let Helen break down, I would be playing right into her hands. She wanted chaos. She wanted to shift the focus from her crimes to me, from the cheating father-in-law to the daughter-in-law. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my voice cold and steady. You can invent lies, but I can deliver the truth. Tiffany paused. Helen looked at me, clutching at me as if I were a lifeline. Kevin turned to me, his eyes filled with confusion. I didn't waste time with explanations. I took out my own phone and played a recording I had saved from her last visit, the one I had made when she was standing in the doorway. Her voice, clear and undeniable, filled the room. Asterisk, I'm not really pregnant. I just need the money. You promised you'd take care of me, so take care of me. Asterisk, the sound of her own words was like a sledgehammer. I saw Helen's mouth fall open before she let out a guttural scream. You liar. You lied to my son. You lied to my husband. You lied to this whole family. She lunged at her, but Kevin stood frozen, his face a mottled red and white, as if he didn't know who to be angry at first. Richard bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Tiffany's face went pale. For the first time, her lipstick and her confidence couldn't save her. She lunged for my phone, her voice frantic. You recorded me. I pulled it back, my grip like iron. No. You spoke. I just saved it. I looked her straight in the eye, each word dropping like a stone. You were going to cast doubt on my son's paternity to make my family destroy itself, weren't you? But you forgot one thing. Your mouth speaks, but other people's ears listen, and other people's devices record. Richard finally broke down completely, the sound of a broken old man's sobs filling the room. He looked at Tiffany, his voice shattered. Tiffany, why? Why were you so cruel? Why did you push me this far? I felt no pity for him. I only felt a deep sadness that a man in his late 50s, once a pillar of his family, had been brought to his knees by such a cheap, dirty game. Tiffany spun on him, her eyes blazing with fury, her voice a shrill shriek. You shut up. You wanted a young girl. You got what you paid for. Did you really think I loved you? That sentence was a final, brutal slap, not just to Richard, but to whatever fantasy he had been clinging to. Helen, hearing this, seemed to lose her mind. Did you hear that? She wailed, tears streaming down her face. Do you see what he was to her? And you? You almost destroyed an innocent man for times this asterisk. Tiffany, breathing heavily, spat out one last, cold-hearted line that froze the room. I needed your money, not your husband. He was just an old, rich wallet. After that, no one could speak. Kevin stood as if turned to stone. Helen collapsed into a chair, clutching her chest. Richard stared at the floor. A man who had just died inside his own respectable life. And I looked at Tiffany, and only one thought remained. A person who would use a child as a weapon, who would call my father honey to humiliate him, who would trample on my mother-in-law with such glee if I didn't stop her today, she would come back tomorrow and stomp even harder. And I knew, from the moment she ripped off her own mask with that one single phrase in old, rich wallet, that her game was finally over. Not because she had given up, but because I now held the two things she feared most: evidence and my own composure. After Tiffany's final, chilling confession, a heavy silence descended on the house. No one had the strength to scream anymore. Helen sat in a daze, her hands limp in her lap. Kevin stood motionless, his eyes red-rimmed. Richard remained hunched over, a man who had lost everything. I looked around at the wreckage. I knew that if I softened now, for the sake of family, tomorrow would bring another envelope, another phone call, another humiliation. And next time, it might not just be my father who was dragged into it. I picked up my phone and called the police again. This time, my hands were steady. When the officers returned, I laid everything out clearly: the extortion, the illegal access of the security system, the conspiracy to stage a crime and frame an innocent person. I didn't speak with anger, just the calm, steady voice of someone stating facts that needed to be recorded. Helen tugged on my sleeve, her voice a raw whisper. Maya, please, don't make this a public spectacle. The shame. I looked at her for a long time. I no longer saw the domineering woman who had pointed a finger at my father. I saw a frightened old woman, terrified that the reputation she had spent a lifetime building was about to be shattered. I said slowly, Are you ashamed because people will know, Mom? Or are you ashamed of the truth itself? She couldn't answer. I added one more thing, my voice soft but clear. I can forgive this family for a mistake made in anger that hurt my father. But I cannot forgive someone who blackmails and sets traps. If I stay silent today, tomorrow will be worse. Tiffany was taken to the station for questioning. As she was escorted out, she looked back at me, her eyes no longer triumphant but still defiant. You think you've won? It's a long life. I met her gaze, my voice even. Life is long. That's why I'm taking out the trash now. The front door closed. This time, the sound was different. It wasn't the sound of panic, but of a final, clean break. Richard later had to give a formal statement to the police about the false accusation and the misappropriation of marital property. The officers explained that if the family chose not to press criminal charges for the theft, they would consider leniency, but a record would remain. I watched him sitting there, his back more stooped than ever. I felt no satisfaction, only a deep sense of sorrow. A man once seen as a patriarch now sat across from a police officer like a common offender. Helen no longer screamed. She just sat and watched her husband, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. She muttered to herself, I gave you decades of my life, and this is the shame you repay me with. In that moment, I understood that some prices are not paid with money, but with the complete and utter collapse of trust. Kevin walked over to me, his voice hoarse. Maya, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for what my family put your father through. I looked at my husband. I didn't recriminate, and I didn't cry. I just said, an apology doesn't erase what happened, but it's a start. He nodded, and for the first time, he didn't look away. I drove my father home myself. I carried his bag for him, as if I were trying to give back the respect he should never have lost. He walked slowly, his steps heavier than usual. When we got to his door, he turned to me and said quietly, It's okay, Maya. Go home. Keep your family together. I looked at him, my throat tight, but I answered clearly, a family should be a place where you're respected, Dad, not a place where you have to swallow humiliation. Before I left that day, I returned to my in-laws' house and made my position clear, not with defiance, but with the weariness of someone who was done fighting. If you want me to stay, Helen, you will apologize to my father in front of the same relatives who witnessed the accusation. Richard, you will sign a legal document promising no further contact with that woman, and you will be solely responsible for repaying the money. And Kevin, we will separate our finances completely, and you will protect your son and me. If you can't agree to these terms, I am taking my son, and I am leaving. I will not spend another day living like this. No one objected. My father held his grandson, looking down at the baby sleeping peacefully in his arms. He whispered, his voice thick with emotion, Your grandpa may not be rich, but he's not a thief. Tears streamed down my face. He wasn't saying it for anyone else. It was the quiet affirmation of a good man whose core had been violated. On the drive back, I realized something with absolute clarity. Some things we think are so precious, a $25,000 necklace, a reputation in front of relatives, are ultimately meaningless. In the end, the only thing that truly matters is the honor of the person who raised you and the ability to look your own child in the eye without shame. I stood on the doorstep of that house one last time that day, my son in my arms, my heart no longer trembling. I said, my voice not loud, but firm enough for everyone to hear, a $25,000 necklace can be pawned. But my father's honor is not for sale at any price. And from that moment on, I knew I had chosen my path. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be a path I could walk with my head held high.